You're watching The Property Cast, powered by the award-winning Total Landlord Insurance.
Welcome everybody to this podcast. I'm Sean Hooker, I'm Head of Redress at the Property Redress Scheme.
I'm Paul Shamplina, I'm the founder of Landlord Action and the Chief Commercial Officer of Hamilton Fraser.
On today's podcast, we're going to be talking about damp, mould and condensation, which is a real bugbear for a lot of landlords and letting agents out there. And I've got two lovely experts that are going to be taking this through all the things you need to know about this.
Hi, I'm Suzy Hershman. I'm Head of Dispute Resolution at mydeposits, and I'm one of the Legal Division Managers of Quality and Customer Engagement at the Property Redress Scheme.
Hi, my name is Julie Ford, and I'm one of the Specialist Advisors on HFIS Letting Agency Advice Line.
Suzy, what is damp, mould and condensation?
Well, they all have different definitions. There is a variety of things. There's a variety of causes. I would say in my experience of dealing with complaints across mydeposits and the Property Redress Scheme, that there are never two cases the same. And it is the most difficult thing to define at not being experts ourselves. So very often we see structural things going on as well as tenant lifestyle. There's a myriad. I mean, where do you want to start with it?
Well, let's start with Julie. Over the 28 years of being a property manager, you didn't come across this problem very often, did you?
No, not once in my day did I come across this. Yeah, absolutely. As Suzy's has already talked about, it is the most common problem in the lettings industry for landlords and letting agents alike. I think the most common problem is condensation, because without condensation you actually can't have damp. So you need that condensation first, and really condensation is just the amount of water that is in the air. And what's interesting for that is actually the cooler your house, the less water content you actually have in the air. Now that means that water content's got to go somewhere, and it will land on surfaces, which is why you sometimes go into a property, you see it running down the walls, you see wet surfaces in the kitchen. So it's really important for tenants to understand that if they're not turning the heating on, they're actually creating more condensation, which will inadvertently lead to the damp issue.
Brilliant. Okay, and Paul, over the years that you've been involved in the property industry, well, you've actually, I've seen your television programme, and sometimes some of the properties that you have to go in and take possession back of, they've got to that state where they haven't been well kept, and damp and mould appears to be a major problem for that. And of course, when you see somebody in that situation, your heart has to go out for them that they've been living in that condition. But maybe just the tenants have been partly to blame.
Well, look, under the Decent Home Standard, 21% of properties are not fit up to a certain spec, which actually, believe it or not, is worse than the social housing sector, which I don't think we would all have believed, to be honest. But damp, condensation and mould, a lot of it is down to the tenants not ventilating the property, not keeping the windows open, having washing machines on all the time. I think also we have an issue now where it will become more prevalent because, of course, you've got tenants that can't afford to move to other properties. And if you think about population growth, there's more people living in properties than ever before, albeit small properties. You might have 4 people living in a 2-bed flat, where ideally you'd have 2 people, which means there's more usage. If you think about what happened during COVID, there was loads more people staying at home. So there was much more use. And of course, what's going to happen with damp, mould and condensation when now we have the energy crisis? Is there actually going to be people putting on their energy bills normally in the winter months? They might be holding off, and that might be an issue as well. I think obviously what we also need to look at, which is obviously defined in tenancy agreements, is regular inspections made by landlords and made by agents, and of course being able to see what state your rental property is in. Sometimes you don't get an issue with regard to gaining access. We did a recent survey on Landlord Action where 45% of landlords are unable or have had problems gaining access. But maybe, Suzy, you can give a bit more light with regard to inspections and what regularly occurs when we're getting calls on the mydeposits customer service line.
something I was talking to Julie about earlier actually was inspections, but it came off the back of actually start as you mean to go on. I think, Julie, if you just want to start and then I'll carry on again.
Yeah, absolutely, thank you. So it's all to do with setting the level of expectation. So we have to understand that tenants are our customers, and sometimes customers don't know how to look after the product that they're given, i.e. your property. So I think a welcome pack with information in there about condensation, ventilation and how to manage that situation is really key to setting how your property is going to be looked after, especially now we're coming up to the winter season. So Suzy, if you want to sort of carry on from there.
So I think it's really important for agents and landlords to recognise and manage expectations that damp can happen in older properties as well as newer properties. The way that newer properties are built is they're made to be hermetically sealed, actually, so they hold the moisture in. So that's the importance for ventilating and heating, particularly in the winter. But mid-term inspections is key because you don't know what's happening to your property during the tenancy. And actually, if you just leave it, then who knows what you're going to end up with in terms of damage. The cost of living crisis is making it more difficult to heat a property, but there are lots of tips and tricks out there that are there to help everybody.
Okay, so Julie, in terms of the law, this is something that you are passionate about, kind of knowing every single one of the
no pressure.
No pressure. So we have out there, and I always get this wrong, but it's the health, housing, and safety standards.
The Housing, Health and Safety Rating System.
The rating system. I told you I'd get that one wrong. And that is the benchmark by which say the local authority would look at a state of a property. We've also got the homes fit for human habitation and decent home standards. So these are the sort of tools that are available legally to enforce home standards. But from what I can see, they're not always straightforward, and there's quite I wouldn't say a faff, but quite a procedure for, say, a tenant to raise a complaint, or for a landlord to understand what legal obligations that they actually have.
No, absolutely. And it comes back down to, again, legislation is never easy. A lot of these legislations will contradict each other, so sometimes the processes are different, even though technically they're the same. So with the Fitness for Human Habitation Act, the most important thing is that the tenant is responsible for reporting the issue. The landlord can't do anything unless they know about the problem. So that's the key there. And then the landlord has got a certain amount of time to be able to act on that issue that's been reported to them. So you're going to have problems as well if you need to get tradesmen in, etc. So there's timelines there that landlords need to work with. With the health and safety rating system that you spoke about just now, that's more to do with the 29 hazards that are in a property. And those 29 hazards will be looking at the impact directly on health, impact to life and that sort of thing. So that's more extreme, and that's where councils could come in and serve prohibition notices and actually force landlords to do work. But really, even down to the decent home standard, it is still the tenant's responsibility to report the issue in the first place before the landlord can actually act.
Brilliant. And Paul, EPCs, we've had a lot of talk about EPCs as a way of measuring the environmental friendliness, let's say, of a property. But of course, that standard's going to tighten up in the private rented sector. I know a lot of landlords are really concerned about the cost it's going to cost in terms of insulating their house. But again, that's got an impact on damp and mould as well, hasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, the new EPC ratings will come in from 2025 to 2030. Actually, out of everything that's been happening for the industry, I mean, obviously the biggest challenge at the moment for landlords is increase in interest rates, the Renters Reform Bill. But EPC, especially for older properties, is going to be a big challenge because you're going to look at an average cost of about approximately £10,000 to upgrade an EPC, which unfortunately for some landlords is going to be the tipping edge. And it will force landlords to sell properties. We're seeing a massive instruction increase on Section 21 instructions at Landlord Action. But of course, bringing a property up to a grade C and above is a big deal. And again, like whatever happens when there are announcements of government, and they've been preoccupied at the moment, especially when it relates to the Renters Reform Bill, is you don't get the devil in the detail, and we're waiting to hear from that. And if you don't get that and you don't relay the messaging clearly to landlords, then what happens is you get panic. And unfortunately, what you will see is you'll see a result of some really decent tenants unfortunately being served with Section 21 notices, not just because of increase with regard to EPC ratings, and of course, properties need a higher rating, because some of the properties that I've seen over my years have been shocking.
You know, in the private rented sector, I think on the whole that the housing stock is older, so than the social housing sector. So that's, you know, you already got inherent kind of structural, I wouldn't say defects that actually can lead to these problems. You know, and they need more maintenance, and they need to be,
Well, I would say, Sean, I mean, if you've got a property in, let's say, County Durham, and you've got a universal credit tenant who's paying you $5-6 grand a year, and you've got you've got equivalent of most probably an E rating, and it's going to cost you 10 to 15 grand. It's going to wipe out 3 months rent, 3 years rent, sorry, in one hit with regard to upgrade. Is it worth keeping that property?
No, absolutely.
But I can tell you now from speaking to, I've spoke to a few funds, and I speak to some big corporate landlords that have 500 plus properties. They are all scaling up. And actually, they're scaling up in a big way, and of course, they're looking for movement and market. So the bigger boys in the industry want to add to their portfolio, and I do see a swift change of a lot of the smaller landlords that are selling, the 1 to 3 landlords that got 85% of or 85% of landlords have that stock. They will be selling that stock most probably to owner occupiers, first time buyers, but also landlords.
Okay, so we're kind of like looking at a little bit of a perfect storm on this, and go back to cause and effect on damp on mould, and again, you know, there are so many definitions and arguments over this. You know, my basic was always that you know, damp was usually property structure and down to the landlord, and condensation was lifestyle. I know that's very simplistic, but now we've got a situation, you know, post COVID and onwards. You know, a lot of people are working from home. They're staying at home a lot longer, and of course they're breathing, which is a natural thing to do. That creates.
Can't we stop them from breathing? Can't we stop them from breathing?
You can't stop them from breathing.
Right,
You can't put that in the tenancy agreement, I'm afraid. That causes condensation, making cups of tea.
It's not, I was going to say, it's not just breathing and being in the property, it's everything else that they're doing in the property. They need to be conscious of the things that they should be doing to keep the property itself breathing and not suffocating with the moisture. So there's lots of tips and tricks. We've actually got a lot of guides on our website that are going on, I think, this month about damp and mould, where it comes from, what you can do to help it, about managing the cost of living crisis and avoiding it. You still have a responsibility to ventilate and heat a property, no matter what you're doing, no matter what you can afford, unfortunately. You know, otherwise you're going to be in trouble and responsible for the damage that results from it, which is where disputes come in with mydeposits and the PRS.
But do you find that because we are now going to be entering the winter months, and tenants will be very, very conscious of their electricity bills and gas bills, do you find that they're not going to open the windows as much? Do you think that's going to be an issue, and we'll see that resurrecting and resulting in part of end of tenancy disputes?
I do, but if they do read all the guidance we've put out there, just opening a window for 5 or 10 minutes first thing in the morning when they get up, or similarly before they go to sleep, or for 5 minutes in the day if you're working from home, using after a shower, you know, there are all these things for 5 minutes at a time. It's not going to affect you using the electricity. It's not going to affect, but it's going to manage the property. And that's where we go right back to the beginning from what Julie and I were saying, making sure landlords and agents are doing their midterm inspections to make sure all that is happening.
But do you find that most probably landlords self-managing most probably don't do as many inspections as they should do?
Okay, so that goes back to something that I talk a lot about when I'm out there educating, is build and maintain a really good relationship with your tenant. They then won't be frightened to come to you if there's a problem with the property, and can let you know at any point when there's something going on. But yeah, you should always be looking at your properties, keeping in touch with your tenants.
Julie, I mean, you see it from both sides. I mean, you've been a tenant. You are a tenent at the moment, as well as being a landlord. And that's quite common now. That you could be a tenant and have a property away from that. So you've lived as a tenant, so you've seen it from both sides of that. And again, another thing I know you're very passionate about is fuel poverty, and actually. Absolutely. I bet there are people out there that are scared to put the heating on over a certain temperature. What is that ideal temperature? I know it depends on the house, etc.
Absolutely. It does depend on the house, because obviously, that, as Paul's already touched on, there are properties out there that were built, historically, so therefore they've got solid brick walls and everything like that. But predictably, really, you should be looking at heating your bedrooms at 18 degrees C and 21 degrees C for main living rooms. But what's interesting looking at other statistics is that 35% of heat is actually lost through the walls of property. We would assume it's the roof because heat rises. That's only 20% of heat. So it's really interesting to look at that and think, well, where am I losing the most of my heat? A lot of radiators are up against walls. So I'd say another tip would be get some tin foil, put it behind the radiator and reflect that heat back into the room. Then you're not losing it through the wall as well.
I would say another tip is use the walls as a really good example. Don't push your beds right up against the walls. Allow the moisture to collect between the two things, because the wall and your bed will be a completely different temperature. Do not put furniture up against the radiators, because you're blocking the heat. You want to maximise any heat you're trying to put into the property right from the minute you set the heat going. So little things like that. It's been well publicised, keep your showers shorter, drop your heating by 1 degree, as Julie says, maybe where 21 degrees is recommended, 20 is good enough for you.
Yeah, exactly. And staying on the theme of the bedroom as well, what I found really interesting was for an average 8-hour sleep, the single human being expels 90 litres of water.
Really?
Yeah, I found that quite interesting. If you think that's an awful lot of moisture...
It's a lot of sleep as well.
That is a lot of sleep. But as you think, as you breathe out, you don't see that moisture, but it does gather. So if your house is cold, if your bedroom's cold, your walls are cold, it's going to gather on the walls, and that's going to be where your problem starts. So if you've got those little trickle vents on your windows, you won't feel the cold coming out of those trickle vents, but they will add the ventilation.
But what about if you talk a lot of hot air?
Well, hopefully that will counteract the problem.
That's what I thought.
Yes.
You can just lower your heating bill.
Any other things that you can do? I mean, dehumidifiers. I think I had a cold wall problem in my place, so I got one of those little plastic things with a blue tablet that you put in.
I think the issue with dehumidifiers are the cost of running them. They can be horrendous when it comes to the electricity, especially if you're trying to drag a lot of moisture out of the air. The little portable ones that you can pick up in your local supermarket or something that goes on the windowsill, yeah, they're great, but you've still got to manage how you're delivering that condensation to start with, how it's actually happening. So it goes back to what Suzy was saying, you've got to ventilate your properties. Even if you're doing it for 5 minutes in the morning, 5 minutes before you go to bed, it will make such a difference to the damp and mould issues in your property.
Okay, and this is another small area, but it's amazing how many I've seen of these, where you do still have landlords who are including bills in the in the rent, and keep tight control of the heating controls. So, I mean, are they permitted to do that? B, if you're kind of trusting the tenant to try and manage the property, you're not giving them the control of the heating. Well, I mean, what advice would you give to landlords out there that don't want the tenants to be using too much?
I think that the basic answer is that don't include bills in the rent. If you don't want control, if you don't want the tenants to use as much electricity, you have them pay the bill. That's probably the quickest answer, but that's not always manageable. In HMOs, if you've got different tenants, some like the heating on, some don't, some bath for hours, some shower for hours.
There's obviously prepaid meters as well, that they become more expensive. I think on that point, as a landlord, you shouldn't ever really want utilities on your name. I've had landlords that have come to me and spoke to me, and they included utilities in their name, and they've ended up having a cannabis factory at their property, and they're on the hook for $5,500 in electricity bill. So, as a landlord, better practice is you should never have utilities put in your name.
And when it comes to the control, I mean, I've read in the in the various standards that the tenant's got to have some form of control of the heating of that property. So.
Yeah, absolutely, because you don't necessarily know the personal circumstances of a tenant. It could be that they have a medical condition that requires additional heating or something like that. But also just a sort of a side topic, really. Landlords who do include the bills need to be mindful that they are not charging the tenants more than what they're being charged by the supplier, because then that sort of dips its toe into the territory of the resale of fuel, and that's a highly regulated industry, and you don't particularly want to become an agent for that if you're not regulated.
I think the downside of that, the disputes that we see, mydeposits particularly, will be the landlords suddenly claiming the excess, and actually justifying the excess is quite a difficult thing to do.
Yeah.
Because the companies don't necessarily provide you with the exact details that you need, and then it becomes contentious.
Yeah.
So I think with the way that things are at the moment, it's probably a good idea for landlords to stop thinking about including bills. It used to be a USP.
Yeah.
I get it. It was quite a sensible thing to do. It means that tenants know exactly how much they're paying, but maybe not so good now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Let's have just a quick summary in terms of you deal with the dispute sides of it, Suzy. So if a landlord is tried to to make a claim against the deposit, what are 3 kind of tips that you would say to when they're presenting to mydeposits a dispute that they would need to include to maximise their chances of getting some money back from the
You would need, unless you've got any admission by a tenant that they have helped cause the problem. Maybe they didn't report something when they should have done, or something like that. Or then you really need to have some expert advice. You need to have some kind of expert report. It may not be to the extent of a damp expert. It might be a plumber that can give you enough information depending on what's causing the problem. But if you're looking at something that is indeterminable, and it could be structure and it could be tenant lifestyle, and you haven't got the evidence, then you're going to need a damp expert, a survey. And they can be costly. So midterm inspections, I come back to those.
And on that precise point, Julie, when you get an agent ringing up saying, look, I've had damp and mould reported in my property, in the property I'm managing, but the landlord doesn't seem to want to do any of the work, what advice would you give to an agent out there that, about the importance of this in terms of, welfare for the tenants, but also protecting the property of the...
I think it really goes back to the start of the tenancy and setting that level of expectation. If you're giving the tenant enough information to be able to manage the mould, regular inspections, as Suzy's already commented on, because if you're going into a property regularly and you're seeing little bits of mould here and there, you can help the tenant manage that. But once it becomes, all over the wall and it's a big problem, that's harder to manage. So for me, it's drip feeding to the tenant, really, but also be strong enough and be confident enough to be able to go back to the landlord and go, look, this is your repairing obligation, and this is what needs to be done. And just know that as the agent, you are the property professional in this triangle, and you are there to help both the client, your landlord, and the customer, your tenant.
Brilliant. That is absolutely fantastic advice. Now, those people who are familiar with listening to these podcasts know that Paul asks a little question of our guests.
Yeah, so we always ask our guests a question, and I'm going to ask Suzy and Julie a question. The money's got a bit skinnier. Maybe is that the cost of living crisis? I've been told by my producer. Yes, it is. Right. Okay. So you've got £20,000 given to you by Sean. He's got plenty of money.
Thank you, Sean.
I've been told. So you've got £20,000, which is not a lot in the grand scheme of things with regard to a deposit, but you've got to make it work with regard to a rental property. Julie, what would you do with it, and why?
So I've based it on the fact that I already have a rental property and the changes that I would make to that rental property to make it a better investment. I would invest in an electric car charging point and extend the parking.
Nice. Okay, so you can maximise more rent.
Yeah.
Correct. Suzy?
I would, as a landlord myself, I would want to install solar panels on the roof that I have. As we know from climate change issues, our summers are getting warmer, we're getting more storms, so the wind and the sun together could generate the sort of power that you need to heat and light to your property and help future tenants and prospective selling if I want to sell down the line.
Good answers, good answers.
Well, I think we've covered an awful lot in this in this podcast, and I hope it's been useful for you guys out there. So thank you, Julie, Suzy and Paul, and thank you to you, our listeners. Just before I go, I want to signpost you to our ultimate guide to damp and mould on the Total Landlord Insurance website. We also have a tenant checklist which you can give to your tenants that gives them helpful advice and tips on how to prevent these problems. And also I want to signpost you to the case studies that we have on mydeposits, which are on our content hub. Thank you very much for joining us, and see you next time.
You've been watching the Property Cast, powered by the award-winning Total Landlord Insurance. For more, please visit totallandlordinsurance.co.uk.